Good evening and welcome to another edition of the WVU Alumni Webinar Series. In celebration of Women's History Month, we'll be asking Dr. Jessica Wilkerson 5 big questions tonight about her critical research and her teaching on U.S. women's and gender history, labor history, and Appalachia. Dr. Wilkerson earned her bachelor's degree at Carson Newman College and her master's degree from Sarah Lawrence College before interning at the Tamiment Library and the Wagner Labor Archives at NYU. In 2008, she completed her PhD in history at UNC Chapel Hill and then served as a faculty member and researcher at the University of Mississippi. Dr. Wilkerson currently serves as an associate professor and the Robbins Chair of History in the Eberly College at WVU, where she teaches Appalachian and 20th century U.S. history. Dr. Wilkerson has collaborated on and co-founded several oral history and public history projects, including the Long Women's Movement Project at the Southern Oral History Program, the Invisible Histories Project Mississippi to document LGBTQ+ history in Mississippi, and the Black Families Project, the MS Oral History Project at the University of Mississippi. She has enjoyed continuing community-engaged collaborations and projects at WVU. Dr. Wilkerson specializes in the histories of Appalachia and the South, modern America, women and gender, and labor and the working class. Her recent book, To Live Here, You Have to Fight, reveals Appalachian women as the indomitable caregivers of a region, and often overlooked actors in the movements that defined their time and continue to impact our lives today. Dr. Wilkerson, hello.
Hi, Meredith. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We have been anticipating this conversation with you for quite some time. So thank you for making some time to talk with us tonight. I know as a researcher myself, I've followed your work since before you came to WVU, actually. And as you can see here by the number of sticky notes in your recent book, I have spent a lot of time with your writings. So tonight, as a guest in our 5 questions series, I'll be presenting you with 5 big questions for you to answer for our audience. And then those will be followed by a round of rapid fire questions for us to all get to know you a little bit better. And then if time allows, we'll have a few moments for some Q&A from the audience. So how does that sound?
I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. So before we begin, I'd like to remind the audience that if you have a question you'd like to ask tonight, be sure to drop it in the comment section, and we will get to those at the end. We'll be looking forward to asking Jessie those questions. And if that's it, I think Jessie will go ahead and get started.
I think I'm ready.
All right. So before you came on screen tonight, I gave the audience a sneak preview of some of the accomplishments on your path to WVU, but I think we'd all love to hear a little bit more about the personal and professional journey that led you to becoming an Appalachian and women's historian.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I always start with telling people that I grew up in East Tennessee, and I was introduced to ideas about Appalachian history pretty early from my grandmother. And her people were Welsh settlers in the Tennessee Valley in the 18th century. And when she was a girl, her family was displaced from the valley as part of the Tennessee Valley Authority projects to build dams during the New Deal. So that was a project to help generate electricity for the South. And so I grew up hearing those stories, and she would take us, me, my brother and sister, to the Museum of Appalachian History. So in a lot of ways, I couldn't escape becoming a historian. I also grew up on the old farm of my grandfather, where he grew up and where his parents lived. And the history was kind of etched into the landscape there. There were daffodils that his mother had planted. There were old persimmon trees. There were steps kind of carved into the bank that didn't lead to a house any longer, but it used to lead to their house. And then his one-room schoolhouse was down the road. And so, I was surrounded by kind of this, all this stuff that kind of spoke to history. But, I think we all are all the time. But it's when I got to college and then to graduate school that I really wanted to learn more about kind of the often unspoken parts of history. So for instance, the history of women's labor, of unionization campaigns, of the civil rights movement in Appalachia, and other liberation campaigns. So, I had a really strong foundation on which to ask those questions and to be curious about how and why people live the lives they do. So that's it in a nutshell.
Well, thank you for giving us that insight into your personal journey. I know, as I'm sure you have seen here at WVU, so many of us have family ties and roots in some of the work that you have done. So many of our families have grown up in the Appalachian region, and so I definitely speak on behalf of many in sharing how grateful we are to have you here at WVU. And so I know we don't often get a chance to talk to researchers in the way that I wish that we did. And so I'd love for you to give us some insight into what an average week might look like for you as a scholar practitioner, and kind of how you keep this personal mission front of mind as you teach and research in the Eberly College.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, Meredith, let me just say that I'm also really grateful to be here. So, because I arrived here in August, so in the middle of the pandemic, and everyone's been incredibly welcoming. It's been a great transition moving here. For an average week, I typically try to reserve my mornings for reading and writing. And of course, things aren't typical right now because of the pandemic. So, once we get out of pandemic life, I'll be doing more archival research and visiting archives, including the wonderful archives here at WVU. But right now it's a lot of, like, if you saw my desk is in front of me, and there's probably 50 books sitting on my desk of things I'm reading right now as I'm working on some new projects. So usually that's my morning. It's really that's when I think the best, that kind of thinking that's required for kind of processing ideas and writing. And so those are mornings. And then after lunch, I often have meetings with students. And right now, of course, that's on Zoom. I can't wait to be back in Woodburn Hall and meeting students one-on-one. But right now, this is fine. It suffices. So I meet with students and we talk about their coursework, we talk about their plans for the future. And then there are other meetings, right? Lots of meetings with colleagues at the college, colleagues in the history department, for things like, everyday sort of things like how we're running things in the department, what undergraduate coursework looks like. And then other kinds of committee meetings around projects that we're working on. And so one thing that I love about being here at WVU is that there's so much interest in doing work with community members and working on collaborations with them. And one exciting project right now is with community members, faculty, from the history department, and also staff at the West Virginia and Regional History Center. And we're working on a new archiving project. So this is kind of, I'm like the shout out to that project. So any of you out there who are interested, get in touch with us. But the project is to archive feminist activist history in West Virginia and the region. So we've been talking to lots of women political leaders, women who were the first coal miners in the state and the region. And we're building an archive that documents this rich women's history. So, I get to do things like that as well, almost weekly. And then, of course, the most important thing that I do is teach. And right now I teach a graduate seminar on Appalachian history. Every week I have the opportunity to get to sit with students and think about how we approach research and write Appalachian history. And of course, that's incredibly rewarding work.
Yes. Well, so I'm glad you mentioned the library and the Regional History Center, because I paid a visit there earlier this year. I was returning. I won't tell you how many books I was returning, because I'm also infamous for checking out a large number of books from the WVU library. But I was returning a number of books, and they had a really incredible feminist activism kind of display in the lobby, and it kind of caught me off guard because it was during this year of just non-traditional everything. And it was really special. So I'm excited to see you all kind of expand on that work, which it sounds like you'll be doing in this project.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's an exhibit on the history of suffrage in West Virginia. I also just saw it, and it's really great.
Yes, it was I'll be honest, it was very emotional to go. It's a very beautiful space, and a beautiful display of activism, but also kind of a troublesome scenario. So very interesting, and I look forward to seeing how this project plays out for you all. So I'd like to spend some time talking about your recent book, which is called "To Live Here, You Have to Fight." For those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, I highly recommend taking the time, especially if you or your people or people you love have roots in Appalachia. It's so clear to me that the women whose stories are brought to life in those pages have impacted our lives here in West Virginia and beyond, and in ways that we might not even realize yet. And so I think the generational effect of their resilience and their advocacy is astounding. And so, help us understand what that experience was like for you to collect those stories through oral history, and, what some of your reflections were along the way in that project.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question, Meredith, because the most rewarding thing about working on that book was getting to interact with many of the women and many of their children, who, for the women who had passed, who could tell their stories. And it's always incredibly rewarding when people are willing to share their stories with you. And so I feel really profoundly grateful to them, and really cherish the relationships that I have with those women. So, the book focuses on women mostly in Eastern Kentucky and the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky, but then I show how they were part of social justice movements across the Appalachian region in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. So they were really part of what they called the Appalachian movement. And learning about their life histories, which is kind of how I approached it, was I wanted to understand their full lives, not just the moment they became politically active or became activists. But doing those life histories helped me understand their broader ways they experienced economic and political changes. And that's often what we're doing as historians. We're contextualizing people's lives. We're showing change over time, and how people perceive their relationships to historical processes. So these women were involved in everything. I mean, they were involved in the war on poverty, all of the major labor movements of the day, community health campaigns, welfare rights movements, and they really fought for fairness and equity in their communities, and they worked for policies that would improve the lives of their neighbors. And so to get at that story, I really needed to hear from the women themselves. These were mostly working class women. Many of them had lived in poverty for a time in their lives. And unfortunately, archives don't always contain the voices or experiences of working class people in general, women in particular. And so, I would do these oral history interviews, and then I could go back to the documents and kind of read against the grain and understand how they participated in all of these campaigns and how they helped to make history. So, that's the takeaway is, with certain histories of people who haven't been really as documented in the archives, is to be creative. I used film as sources, oral history interviews, music. It was important to talk to a lot of people and try to get a sense of their world.
So were there scenarios where you were going into some of their homes and really getting to know these families on a personal basis?
Yes, definitely. So, for example, one family that I got to know were the Easterlings. So I wrote about Edith Easterling who's pictured here with her husband, Jake, and her daughter, Suella Kobach. I should say that Edith was quite sick by the time I was working on this project, and so I wasn't able to interview her. But her daughter, Suella, who was also an activist, so it's mother-daughter activist, she really became a guide for me. She introduced me to a lot of people. She did multiple interviews. I would go out to her home she lives in Southwestern Virginia now, and interview her there. I also interviewed Eula Hall, who's well known to people in Eastern Kentucky because she started a community health clinic called the Mud Creek Clinic that served everyone regardless of their ability to pay. And she still is working. She's well into her 90s, and she's just a powerhouse. So it was really rewarding to get to speak with these women and to get to hear firsthand accounts from them.
Well, and so throughout the book, you maintain a really strong focus on the women as these working class caregivers, right? And in doing so, you showcase this form of feminism that's not often the one that's in the spotlight, especially not in the spotlight in 2021. And so tell us kind of what led you to that perspective?
Yeah, so I think, usually if I ask students what they think the women's movement is or who feminists are, they have a really, there's a really specific image in mind. So it's kind of women in cities, it's white middle-class women, definitely not women in Appalachia, like not really working class women.
Right.
Yeah. And so what I found as I interviewed these women is that they very much considered themselves a part of the women's movement, and that some of them identified as feminists. Eula Hall helped to found the Appalachian Women's Rights Organization. She won an award in 1975, the same time that Betty Friedan did. Like, they shared a stage. And Betty Friedan is like an iconic feminist. So she was often in the same spaces as some of these women. But what I found is that a lot of women in Appalachia, especially working class women, framed issues of what we would call women's issues differently than those kind of iconic feminists who, their concerns are also important, right? They were fighting for certain kinds of jobs, being able to climb kind of the corporate ladder, to have access to credit, to have access to university education, all important things. But the women that I wrote about talked about survival and economic issues. And, for them in their communities, they were often the people charged with feeding people, providing medical care, raising children. And they did so in an environment that was often really harsh, where they had husbands who'd been disabled in the coal mines that might have black lung disease. And so they were fighting for the things that they really needed for a better quality of life for themselves and for everyone. These were things like access to clean water, healthcare, safety issues, and also fighting for a living wage for everyone. And so for them, those were issues of gender equity that should always be discussed as part of the women's movement. And they really claimed a place in the women's movement that unfortunately has too often been ignored. And so in my book, I try to recover caregiving labor and how that informed their feminist activism.
Well, and I think, what it will take are more small steps, right? Like your book, to help change the conversation. And I'm sure that your students, their minds have been so open because of the exposure to you and your research. So again, we're just so grateful to have your perspective here at WVU. So from what I know your next book is going to feature a different perspective of women in Appalachia in partnership with the WVU Press. So could you tell us about that project and your hopes for it?
Yes. So this is a recent development. I'm really excited about it. So I'm working with, I've signed a contract with WVU Press to write a book that we're tentatively calling a Women's History of Appalachia. And basically, a kind of a lifelong dream of mine, or at least since I've been a professional historian, is to write a history that puts women front and center in Appalachian history. I think all of us know that when people think Appalachia, they often think of kind of very masculine identities, kind of masculine, kind of stock characters, coal miners, even mountaineers, right, can often be kind of gendered as masculine. And so in this book, I really want to think about women throughout Appalachian history, from early American history, so, Indigenous women in Appalachian history, all the way up to the present. And it'll be kind of focusing on various women throughout Appalachian history. So really driven by their stories, because that's what I really love to do, is to tell women's stories, but then to contextualize them as part of Appalachian history. So I couldn't be more thrilled to work with WVU Press, which, by the way, check out their catalog. They do amazing work in Appalachian history and Appalachian studies, and have they're constantly publishing the best books on Appalachia. So I'm really honored to work with them.
Absolutely. We will all be looking forward to that one, certainly. So before we move on to the rapid fire questions to get to know you on a more personal level, I want to remind the audience to share any questions that you might have in the comment section below. And then we will get to those after the rapid fire questions. So, Jessie, I am going to ask you 10 very important questions that you are gonna want to answer as quickly as you can. So, are you feeling ready?
I'm ready for it, Meredith.
All right, perfect. The first one is, what are you currently reading?
Oh, as I told you, I have 50 books on my desk, but one of them is this book called Memphis, Tennessee Garrison. And it's part of my research for this new book I'm working on. And it's about a Black woman civil rights activist from West Virginia. And she was involved in the NAACP in the early 20th century. And then I am reading, I'm going to give you 2 books, because I'm trying to read fiction in the evenings, just like something that's not academic or it's not work. And I've been reading Disha Filyal's book, published by WVU Press, longlisted for the National Book Award, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. And it's just terrific. So I highly recommend it.
Yes. I am currently on the wait list for that at the library right now. So I love this. We'll add, I'm sure tonight lots of us are adding these to our lists. Next question, what is your favorite meal?
Chicken and dumplings. Although I don't know how to make them. I never learned from my grandmother. So if anyone has a good recipe, send it to me.
You will probably get some tonight. I know that you are still relatively new here, but what's your favorite spot on WVU's campus?
Yes, so I'm still exploring, but the other day when I was in the library searching for some of these mini books I've checked out, and I learned about the Appalachian Reading Room, which is on the downtown campus library, and it's just hundreds of books on Appalachia, and it's just a really dreamy place for someone like me. So I was really excited to just kind of stumble into that room.
I love that you mentioned, but also you're revealing some of our secrets tonight on the air. What's something that you have recently learned?
So just last week, I learned that there's an old cabin that was part of a Revolutionary era fort located in the Greenmont neighborhood. And this place has been a rental for a long time, but apparently it is an old cabin from the late 1700s. That's what I've heard.
We might have to follow up about that one as well. Jessie, what do you like to do when you're not working?
I take lots of walks on the rail trail. I love the rail trail system here in Morgantown. And then on the weekends, I usually head to one of the many parks. So I love to hike and to be outside.
Yes, well, you have come to the right place. What is your favorite WVU tradition?
Again, I'm learning those. But I do have to say, I mean, this is like the obvious one, but I do love that people learn Take Me Home Country Roads and sing it together. And part of that is like, I was a choir kid. I was always in choir, a cappella choirs and stuff. And I just think it's a really powerful experience to sing with other people. So I love a tradition that involves singing with a huge crowd. So that's a perfect one.
Speaking of songs, what is a song that you can listen to on repeat?
So one of my favorite songs is Wildflowers by Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris. Love it. And it has to be listened to on repeat.
It has to. What is one thing that you can't live without?
So that's a hard one because we've lived without so much during the pandemic, and I really miss being in social spaces. But I was thinking, like, what are the social spaces I miss the most? And it's libraries. I think, as I've already indicated, I love libraries. I think they're amazing institutions at the university and the local public library, and also cafes, right? Being in places where people are just having relationships and sitting and working together. I really miss that.
Yes, I would have to agree with you on that. Jessie, what's one thing you wish you had known in college?
Oh my gosh, this is such a hard one. I think the thing that I wish I'd known is that it's really the main time in your life that you just have to explore whatever you want. So if, I don't know, you want to learn a new instrument or take up a new hobby or learn a language, like that's the prime time to do it. And so I wish that I had known just to like soak it all up as quickly as possible when I was in college.
Yes, absolutely. And our last rapid fire question for you is, what does it mean to you to be a Mountaineer?
So I think to me, being a Mountaineer is really connected to the fact that WVU is a land grant institution. And so I see part of my job here as a faculty member as collaborating with the people of West Virginia, right? So that we can do whatever we can to make this a state and make it a place where everyone can thrive. So that's what I've gathered so far from being here, that's really important to a lot of people.
It absolutely is. Thank you for answering those rapid fire questions. It sounds like we have a lot to discuss offline, potentially in the Appalachian reading room. So it looks like we have several people, though, who are waiting to have their own questions answered. So if you're ready, I have some questions for you from the audience.
Sounds good.
All right. So the first one for you is, what are some tips that you can share with an aspiring author for pitching book ideas to publishers?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. Well, I would say that having a conversation with editors about what their vision is for the press or what kinds of things they're publishing, and make sure that you have a good fit. So a lot of, especially academic presses, have series and they have certain topics that they emphasize. So being aware of those things, I think, is the first thing to think through.
Awesome. Thank you. Our next question is, what is the most challenging aspect of oral history research?
Oh, I love oral history research that it's hard for me to even say what the challenge is. And so the challenge is also one of the rewards. I'm going to do that thing where I kind of flip it because oral history research is, so let me just define oral history first, it's the collaborating with another person to create a public record as an interview. So you're working together to create this public record. And that often means that you are having long conversations about what they're going to talk about in the interview or what they're comfortable with. These are really based on relationships with people. And so that takes a lot of time and a lot of investment. It's very different than going to an archive and reading something from 200 years ago, and you don't have to interact with people. But oral history research is really based on relationships, and relationships are both challenging and rewarding. So that's what I would say.
Yes. Hopefully you will inspire someone tonight to pick up some oral history research. Our next question from the audience is about your books. Are you still working on a book that will cover women's movements in Appalachia through the 80s and 90s and maybe beyond?
Yes, absolutely. So the second book project, it will take a little bit longer for me to finish this one because archives have been closed during the pandemic. But this book is called In Sisterhood in Struggle. And it's about women's movements in Appalachia and the broader South. So really the whole entire region. And so like we already discussed, Meredith, the women's movement is often, it leaves out people in the South and Appalachia. And so I wanted to kind of challenge myself to think about how would I retell the story of the women's movement if I started with women in the South. And I think the narrative is pretty different. It's more working class, it's more diverse racially and ethnically. And many of the issues, as I already discussed, are different. There's a different emphasis. So that book, it'll probably be a couple of years, but I'm working on it.
Well, we will look forward to that. Our next question for you from the audience involves the labor movement. They said the women's labor movement has come a long way, but what are some of the main hurdles that still need to be crossed?
Yeah, that's a good one. So yes, the women's labor movement has come a long way, and women have access to many more careers than they used to have. But then I think, as we all know, the gendered wage gap still exists. I think last week maybe was Gender Equity Day or Pay Equity Day. And so you can look up the data on that. So there's still that gap. And also, I would say that the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest, that has also grown a lot in recent years, especially since the 2008 recession. And so those are real challenges that people are doing working all the time, working multiple jobs, yet they don't have a living wage. And so I think right now we can see this labor movement, kind of a modern day labor movement unfolding in Alabama, where Amazon warehouse workers are currently organizing, and their unionization vote is occurring. I think it's already occurred. The count might be underway over the next few days. And so, those workers are really shining a light on modern day labor issues. And it's a lot of women and people of color who work in those warehouses and don't make enough to make ends meet. So those are big challenges, but they're definitely ones that we should all be thinking about and talking about.
Absolutely. Who are some of your personal and professional mentors?
Well, I would have to say first of all, I won't name them all, but my professors at Carson Newman College. I grew up in East Tennessee and then went to a college that was close to home. I didn't really think of going away, and they really encouraged me, to study Appalachian history and to study women's history. And you kind of gave me permission and it showed me a way to do the things that I wanted to do. And then I'll say Helen Matthews Lewis, who is considered the grandmother of Appalachian studies and was a scholar activist, and worked her entire life to make life better for people in the region, is just an amazing person. You should look her up if you've never heard of her. So those are just a few.
Thank you for sharing that with us. We have a couple more audience questions for you. So this next one involves your path from Tennessee to New York to North Carolina to West Virginia. What are some similarities and differences that you found in your research along the way?
Well, I have to admit that when I started my research, I really wanted to write about women in East Tennessee, right? I was I wanted to do that local history or regional history that was rooted in the place I came from. And when I started with interviewing people there, and they kept saying, you need to go talk to women in Eastern Kentucky. They're the one, they were the role models for us, and their stories are so important, and those are the stories you need to tell. So I found that really interesting, that people in the region were really aware of who was active. And then in North Carolina, I found something similar. So there were these networks of labor activists in North Carolina who were documenting everything that was happening in the coal field. So these aren't really differences. It's more connections, actually, between places that I kind of found as I was moving through them. And then you would think possibly that in New York, those connections were severed. But in fact, it's really, when I was in New York, that's where I learned a lot more about labor history, because I had a professor there who that's what she did. She was a labor historian. And when I was there, I was doing research when I was an intern at the Tamament Library, and was learning all about the Coalition of Labor Union Women. And I came home and I was telling my grandmother all about this amazing research that I was doing. And she said, wait just a minute. And she went and got my grandfather's wallet. He had died when I was a little kid. And he had been a union organizer, and he had worked with the textile workers, one of whom started the Coalition of Labor Union Women. And he was a member, like a supporting, kind of like an ally, right? He had a card that he supported the labor women. And so she showed me this. And it's something we had never talked about, that I had no idea that he had supported that or he was part of it. And it was just doing this research in New York and telling her that opened up that story.
What a special connection. So a couple more questions we have for you before we wrap up. What is one particular story from your interviews that really stands out in your mind and your memory?
Oh, these are always hard because there's so many good ones. I would say that in general, the stories about, really dramatic moments when people were on a picket line or they were at a protest, and they had these really vivid memories of what happened during those events. So it's hard for me to pick out just one, but I would say just collectively, those kinds of stories were really powerful. And it was partly because they were stories that people had told a lot. They were really important stories to them, but they had a lot of meaning and a lot of drama.
Absolutely. How do you practice self-care during the research process?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I take a lot of walks and I take really long walks. And I also run, usually several days out of the week. And again, those are usually, I try to build up to long runs. And that's my self-care. As you can imagine, by the afternoon, late afternoon, my brain will feel really clogged, like with just a lot of information. and also I've been staring at a computer and probably have eye strain and stuff. So I'll go out for an hour and a half or 2 hours and walk and just be away from the computer and my phone and just take in the area and the natural beauty of the place.
Well, that leads us into our last question, which is, are there any places in West Virginia that you would like to visit?
Oh my gosh, there's so many places that I want to visit. And we've gotten around a bit since we got here, but one place we haven't been is Harper's Ferry. And I've just heard that, for a historian especially, that it's such a rich, so many rich stories there and really great things to see and do. So I'm hoping to get there soon.
Yes, I won't spoil any of those surprises for you, but there are quite a few that are very fun. So that concludes our audience questions and all of our big and small questions for you today. Jessie, what are the best ways to stay connected with you and your work in the future?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter. You can DM me. And then also you can find me at my website. And my email addresses are on there as well. So I'm always happy to hear from people. So feel free to reach out.
Well, Jessie, we thank you for being with us this evening and for all that you do to share your knowledge and your perspective with the students and everyone at WVU. And honestly, for the research that you continue to engage in that just allows all of us to challenge our own understanding of history and the region that we call home. So thank you for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, Meredith. This was really fun.
Absolutely. We'll see you another time soon.
Okay, bye.
To those of us who have joined us at home tonight, we thank you for spending your time and your evening with the Mountaineer family. And we hope you'll consider becoming members of the WVU Alumni Association if you aren't already. Our next segment of the WVU Alumni Webinar Series will take place on April 14th with the Center for Active West Virginia. We'll be learning more from the experts about how teams at WVU are working to increase physical activity in children and adults throughout the state. And we hope to see you there. Have a good night.